It is always a pleasure for me to welcome my next guest to the show, Diana West. How are you, Diana?
I'm fine, Jason. It's always a pleasure for me to join you.
And the thing that I like about it so much, not just your incredibly pleasant demeanor, but I always learn so much when you come on the show about stuff that I cannot believe that I didn't know about. And frankly, I can't believe that the public at large doesn't know about. I think before we fully dig in today, it might be worthwhile to help everybody just with a little
Fine, Jason.
background.
It's a pleasure for me to join you.
And the thing that I like about it so much, you've got a volume on somewhere. Do you have YouTube on your computer going?
Let me see. Hold on.
Sorry about that. About stuff that I
Hang on one
cannot
sec.
believe that
Possible.
I didn't. And frankly, we'll take care of that. That the public at large
hang on one
doesn't
sec.
know about. No problem. We've got everybody just kind of getting ready for the broadcast to begin.
Okay.
I think you got it. There we go.
I'm so sorry.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it at all. But the thing I was going to say is we're going to be talking a bit today about the Weather Underground. And the thing that amazes me about it so much is that when I ask people if they know what it is, most people think it's an app on the phone for telling you what the weather is. And that is not the aspect of it that we're going to discuss. So before we get too deeply into today's topic, and I do want to remind people they can learn more about Diana by going to dianawest.net. I really do recommend that people purchase and read both American Betrayal and The Red Thread. Diana has been writing about this communist infiltration of the United States of America for so long. I mean, it goes back to days where, frankly, I didn't even realize it was an issue. Diana, what is it that people should really know about the Weather Underground?
Well, before I say that, I wanted to explain why a 1960s, 1970s revolutionary organization is even relevant in this incredibly hot political moment in America. And that has a lot to do with the fact that Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate for president, we think, has been endorsed by a number of revolutionaries of that late 60s, early 70s vintage. That would include a number of, scores of people, it seems, signed a letter to the nation from the former Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. This is the organization that spawned the Weather Underground. We've seen Angela Davis, herself a communist vice presidential candidate twice in the 1980s, endorsing Joe Biden. We've seen, thanks to the amazing reporting of Andy Ngo, who's told us so much about the Antifa militants, we know that a group from the CHOP, remember the CHOP, has endorsed Biden. There's another group, the Revolutionary Communist Party, Bob Avakian, another one of these people from that same period of the 1960s, 1970s, endorsing Joe Biden. And the reason that that's important to really bear in mind, besides what it says about Joe Biden and where he would take the country, is if we go back just over a decade to Barack Obama's candidacy, Barack Obama having been introduced politically by Weather Underground leaders, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn, as a young up-and-coming politician in Chicago. When that fact came out during the 2008 campaign cycle, all of these people did everything they could, including the Obama campaign, to minimize the relationship, to downplay it, to deny it, to run away from it, to keep him in that, remember, that sacred state he ran in as the post-partisan candidate. Seems ridiculous now, but this was his speech. So that's sort of my preface to it. The second piece that's really important about these people is that the influence of these 1960s, 1970s revolutionaries, really kind of symbolized by Weather Underground, the Black Panther Party, some of the other groups of that time, is that the Black Lives Matter movement claims these people or is deeply influenced by these people, these same revolutionaries. And we all know we've been living through this incredible period where we've seen corporate America, Major League Sports, politicians all across the country, police departments, all the rest of it, embracing this same Marxist group, Black Lives Matter, that owes so much in terms of its ideology and its really its political place in our politics, to this same revolutionary cadre that came up so long ago. I mean, we're talking 50 years ago. So the other interesting thing about it, Jason, is that so many of them are still alive and well and kicking and influential.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
So that's kind of the beginning of why this is really relevant, politically speaking, to each and every American. And then as far as your question, like what is Weather Underground? It came about in that period of violence and revolution that go back 50 years as a splinter group, splintering off the Students for a Democratic Society, which was this national campus or nationwide campus organizations that were prominent in the anti-war movement and civil rights movement, things like that. The Weather Underground took it to a very violent level, bombings, all kinds of we see later in the 1970s, 80s, splinters of them going into bank robberies, killings, shootings at police departments, sniper killings. I mean, this became an incredibly violent movement in conjunction with an array of other revolutionary groups. The names are really they don't really matter, really, but just because they seem to change. And what did they mean anyway? You know, different kinds of group. People know the Black Panthers. There was also the Black Liberation Army, other groups, the May 19th movement, which is one that some of the weather people ended up in, and so on. And it's something that seemed like ancient history to us. I think I certainly did not have personal memory of this period. I did not know what was going on in the 1970s. So for many of us, I think until very recently, this was something that really didn't seem terribly relevant. The Barack Obama story made it more so, but this time now, 2020, is really when we need to drill down. And thank you so much for the opportunity for doing so.
Yeah, I mean, it's my pleasure. You know way more about this than I do, and the books that you've written about this communist Marxist infiltration. I mean, again, anybody who thought that this was 80s Ronald Reagan style propaganda, which I'm one of those people, by the way, need to really think again and need to look at all of this history in the context of what is going on today. The May 19th movement that you mentioned, Susan Rosenberg is part of that, and she's also a principal in this Thousand Currents charity that is providing a lot of the funding to Black Lives Matter. And, you know, there's a whole psychological warfare component to what's going on right now, Diana, in that simply by naming the thing Black Lives Matter, that's an incredibly strategic psychological play when you compare it to something like the Black Liberation Army. I think it would be pretty hard for non-militant Black or white Americans to get behind any kind of army, but the statement Black Lives Matters is so obviously correct in a general sense that disagreeing with it immediately sets you up to be some objectionable person.
It's so brilliant, isn't it? But you're so right to make that point. And it's such an important point to underscore. But look at this. We know that in some ways, the patron saint of the Black Lives Matter movement is a woman named Assata Shakur, born Joanne Chesimard. And she was part of this roiling revolutionary moment in the 1970s and indeed was convicted for murdering a state trooper. Susan Rosenberg was involved, I believe, with certainly these groups in terms of springing this Assata Shakur / Joanne Chesimard from prison. She absconded to Cuba, where she remains. Cuba is a very important country in this revolutionary group, all of these revolutionary groups. And Assata Shakur remains Black Lives Matter, again, sort of patron saint. They frequently reference her, their T-shirts with her name on. So the name Black Lives Matter as a strategic kind of PR sales point is brilliant, but look at the actual linkage right back to that Black Liberation Army type violence and revolutionary firmament. So it is just a nicety. It is not anything. The alliance between these two moments are so strong that we are foolish to be taken in by the kind of sloganeering that we're hearing, but foolish we are, and many have been taken in by it. But this is why it's so important to kind of make these connections. One thing that really struck me early in the summer was watching some of these people coming out, and certainly watching Black Lives Matter take such an important place in our politics. I mean, dominating really all of our politics for quite some time, was this incredible linkage to those revolutionaries, not just Joanne Chesimard. But we can also, if you look a little closer, we had a statement from Patrisse Cullors, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, where she was interviewed and she was asked about the ideological framework for Black Lives Matter in kind of a critical framework for the question. The question was coming via a radio host from a man in jail convicted of killing 2 New York patrolmen. I mean, this is again the kind of the fish pond that these people run in. A man by the name of Muntakil is his last name, Jalil Muntakim, and he was born Anthony Bottom, which is a whole lot easier for us to remember. But he was convicted and is serving a 60-year stretch. And he got a question into this host, chastising a little bit Black Lives Matter, hoping that they were not non-ideological. And the host relayed this as a question, a loving criticism from an elder in the struggle. I mean, this is how these people regard cop killers.
Wow.
And Patrisse Cullors took the question and took it very seriously and announced to the world, "Oh, don't worry, I am a trained Marxist. My co-founder, Alicia Garza, is also a trained Marxist. So there's really no problem there." And that was a quite stunning statement. This really drew many people to look a little closer here, because again, these movements back 50 years ago were also Marxist in character, and the Black Lives Matter movement is as well. I mean, it says so in those kinds of veiled terms on their own website, where they talk about destroying the patriarchy, being against the nuclear family, and so on, being against heterosexuality norms and things like that. I mean, these are the same kinds of cultural targets that all these revolutionaries have been trying to destroy for this same period of time. So that's very important. The movement to defund the police, the movement against incarceration in general, jail for criminal acts, violent acts, these were also the goals going back 50 years of these same revolutionaries. So the parallels, the connection is so strong. It can't be overstated. One of Patrisse Cullors' mentors is a man named Eric Mann, M-A-N-N, and he was a Weather Underground person. He served time for his part in violent assaults on police station, I believe, for attacking Harvard back in the 1970s. So, this is where these people come from. And their moment now is so extraordinary because they have been able to find allies in the corporate world, in the banking world, in professional sports, in the political world. I mean, this is sort of the extraordinary thing that back in the day, the Weather Underground and Black Panther Party and the offshoots did not yet have. Certainly they had sympathizers. Certainly they had help. However, this is a very different moment 50 years later after all the efforts they've made, because what they were able to do, and this is really when you realize how pre-subverted we already were, so many of them were able to enter into the establishment. They were able to go into education. If we look at Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers, for example, many of them were able to go into education, the political world. It's it's truly staggering how they were normalized. So we shouldn't really be quite as shocked to see this seeming collapse today at the knees, on the knees, to the Black Lives Matter movement, because this has been a long time coming. But one place, and I know you wanted to talk about this as well, it was sort of strange to see so many of these names like Susan Rosenberg emerging, and the advent of a man named Chesa Boudin becoming district attorney earlier this year, taking office in San Francisco with this same agenda. Chesa Boudin being, of course, the adopted son of the Weather Underground leaders Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn, and the biological son of a woman named Kathy Boudin, and a man named William Gilbert, who's still in prison. Kathy Boudin had served quite a bit of time for her role in something Susan Rosenberg was also involved in, a Brinks robbery in 1981, the fall of 1981, in a small town outside New York City, Nyack, New York, that left 2 police officers dead and a Brinks guard dead. I think it made 9 children fatherless that day.
Wow.
This was a big bank heist. It was something like a 1 point something million dollar heist of a Brinks truck, and it ended up being a killing field for these police officers and guard, and it ended up with a number of these revolutionaries working with a Black Liberation Army types. I don't remember let's see, they were sort of known as the family. I think this is what they were called at
Right.
this point, the May 19th movement, this kind of thing. But a lot of people who had been in the Black Panther movement were also arrested as a result of this robbery that was not successful. And so many of these same people are now celebrated. And we see Chesa Boudin, the son of the 2 of the bank robbers and convicted in the murder of the officers in the guard, and pushing this same agenda. So it's truly a shocking thing to behold that these people can act with such impunity, and that then they can raise their own revolutionary children who then enter the system with the same goals. So this is kind of what we're looking at. It's what we're up against. Chesa Boudin is certainly not unique. There are many district attorneys, judges, and others, lawyers, and so on, who have a similar drive to this world without policing. And one thing that's really important to remember is what are their goals like? What are their perfect countries? Well, 50 years ago, it was Castro's Cuba. I think it probably still is. And certainly with Chesa Boudin, he worked closely with Hugo Chavez down in Venezuela, another police state. So it's not like these people are really all about freedom and liberty. They are about a very specific program of control, and it involves destroying the structure, destroying our way of life, destroying our Constitution, and that's why it is so dangerous and so important to really understand.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And it's so strategic as well, Diana, because, when somebody's running for president or governor or mayor, we know the names of these people. We know who they are usually, certainly before they even show up. But those among us who are the most dialed in really aren't paying attention to who is the district attorney of this particular city or that particular city. But if you were a sinister, kind of like James Bond villain level globalist billionaire who wanted to hatch a plan to control the United States, this is so smart, because look at what's happened today. Now, I don't know the details of this case against Steve Bannon, but a lot of people have raised the question of, why is Steve Bannon getting dinged for anything to do with charity fraud when we're talking about $25 million and something that just started a couple of years ago, when the Clinton Foundation has been doing charity fraud to the tune of billions of dollars for decades, and nothing has happened. So by controlling law enforcement like this, your friends can get away with murder, literally, while your political enemies can be charged for things that are maybe not exactly crimes, maybe are crimes, maybe are crimes that they look the other way for other people. But you can take really important players off the board by having a district attorney in your front pocket.
Absolutely. And this is the long march through the institutions. It happened here. And that's what's so shocking for Americans to get our arms around. And I think that just looking at the attempt to overthrow President Trump, the coup against President Trump, the Trump-Russia scandal and all its different cycles, is another example where we see no law and order at the top of our government. So it's all at this point very politicized, and I think you make a good point about looking at Steve Bannon and his outfit versus the Clinton Foundation, which and so many other crimes associated with both Bill and Hillary Clinton. This is really where we are, and this is what happens when your institutions are subverted for political ends and not for law, not for justice. It's a very difficult moment because nothing works. If law and order doesn't work, nothing works. And so with that, see coming at it, this effort to utterly junk everything, even at the street level, with the defund the police movement and all the rest of it, it's a very terrifying moment. But this is exactly what these people have lived for. And I guess that's why they're still alive, hoping for this time, such an opportunity for them. Have they overreached? We'll find out in November. But they certainly are out. They're out. And I think that's what is so kind of startling for if you're used to watching communists and subversives work quietly and covertly. I mean, this out there aspect is very disconcerting, but it is not really called too often. One thing that you and I have talked about on and off over the summer is another layer of this, I think, which has to do with 50 years ago and today. And that is, another institution that appears to have been subverted is our medical world, very politicized. Well, one thing that I was looking at over the summer and really, I'm still scratching my head over it, to tell you the truth. I don't feel I've really solved this problem. Bernadine Dorn has a younger sister, and her name is Jennifer Dorn. And while Bernadine Dorn was underground and fighting America as a revolutionary and involved in these violent rampages, Jennifer Dorn was always more or less open and the sort of the outside voice of her sister or her sister's organizations. She was not on the run, in other words, and she was not involved in these overtly criminal acts. She may have been involved in some, however, I won't completely exonerate her, but generally her role was sort of as a spokesgal for these kinds of groups. She was associated with Abby Hoffman's Yippie movement, if you remember that name, or she was also in a group related to the AIRS organization, the weather organization called the Prairie Fire something or other. That was another one of these groups that came together to hold different kinds of press conferences and make statements. She also ran around the world in 1970 with Timothy Leary, if you remember, the LSD guru, with some pretty heavy-duty terrorist people. And this is a real part of her life as well. She also was associated, and this is the thing that was so interesting, she became associated with a medical revolutionary organization known as Lincoln Detox, which began with sit-ins, if you could imagine that, in a Harlem hospital for the purpose of starting a detox center that was pushed by the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers, and the Puerto Rican Marxist group, the Young Lords, and other revolutionaries as well. Their idea was to attack what they used to call, we don't call them junkies anymore, we're not allowed to use that word, but back then you could call heroin addicts junkies. To take the junkies, it was a big problem, and to turn this hospital into a major drug treatment center. And their big idea was, believe it or not, to use acupuncture, which has not been proven to be very effective, in terms of
heroin addiction.
Yeah, they used methadone as well, but what they really were doing was they were indoctrinating these mainly minority, mainly Black, I suppose Puerto Rican as well, patients to the tune of literally dividing their methadone dose for the day between indoctrination sessions, as I've read.
Wow.
So this was, yes, so it was not just the goodness of their heart. They were trying to build revolutionary armies among these very desperate people. And they were doing it on a city budget. They were getting to the tune of $750,000 a year or some such from the
Whoa.
city of New York. There was all kinds of corruption, all kinds of you can imagine what it was like. It barely was overseen. It went on for some years. Jennifer Dorn was involved there. She married one of the co-founders of this Lincoln Detox, a man named Mickey Melendez, had several children with him as well. And the thing finally is brought to a close by after Mayor Koch is elected in 1978, and his assault on it, which actually, interestingly enough, in alliance with an assemblyman, a New York assemblyman at the time named Charles Schumer, who was
Oh,
also very big on taking this place in hand. Mayor Koch was talking about the place. He said things like, thugs don't go to the hospital, patients do. Hospitals are for sick. That was it. Hospitals are not for thugs, they're for sick people. This place is run like a temple to Che Guevara. There were apparently Che Guevara posters up. There were Assata Shakur posters up. I mean, this place was Malcolm X, of course. This place was a revolutionary hotbed. It was a very weird place. Strangely enough, one of the doctors involved came from the very famous Republican Taft family. We had a President Taft.
so wait a minute. So the doctors were involved. See, this is what I want to focus on because you brought this to my attention, Diana. I had no idea that this even occurred. And the thing is, it's like, it's within our lifetime. I mean, I was a little bit young, or maybe it was just before my lifetime, but it's not like this happened 100 years ago. And Lincoln Hospital, the piece I wanted to add, Lincoln Hospital is part of this New York Health and Hospitals system. And it's very interesting what you just said set me off, that doctors were involved, because when the whole COVID-19 outbreak started, I was doing a lot of investigating into this Dr. Colleen Smith, who is at Elmhurst Hospital, which is also part of the New York Health and Hospitals system. And the other thing that is interesting is Lincoln Hospital came into it later when that nurse, Nicole, her last name escapes me, but she was talking about, minorities in the hospital, and put out this social media video that got huge traction, huge following. She was asking for help. I tried to contact her. You would think if you were putting out a social media call for help that millions of people saw, you'd have a Twitter account, you'd have a Facebook account, you'd have a web page that people could contact you through. It was impossible to reach this woman. And the real crazy part is that New York Health and Hospitals is in control of this new test and trace corps that's been announced by another communist we've spoken about in the past, Warren Wilhelm Jr., Bill de Blasio. So this test and trace corps is going to be empowered with all kinds of abilities. If you enter New York or try to cross a bridge or a tunnel into New York or out of New York, they're going to be able to, shove Q-tips up your nose and force you to quarantine and fine you up to $10,000.
Yeah. Well, it may be connected. It's certainly the trend is connected. This notion of medicine as politics. Think of Barack Obama and socialized medicine. I mean, this is something that was one of the first things the Bolsheviks did after the Russian Revolution, going back 100 years, was to socialize medicine. So medicine is seen as a way of control. We've never experienced it like this. We are now under the thumb of medicine. And so that's why this interested me so much, to find these revolutionary Marxists who hate America working in a hospital setting. And the other thing that was going on there were that the people who'd been drawn in also start these violent robberies. I mean, Lincoln Detox was also kind of the alma mater for some of the Brinks robbers as well, talking about that 1981 very famous, infamous robbery. So this is what was going on in the 1970s. I mean, think about what was really underway. We talk about these revolutionaries going to Cuba, going to Soviet Union. I did want to bring this up on the Chesa Boudin. Chesa is actually named for Joanne Chesimard. The Chesa, yes.
I did not know that. Wow.
Just found out. I'm so glad I got it in time for your show.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes. So this is, another one of these linkages. But the Kathy Boudin, when she was a college student, I believe at Bryn Mawr, she took a year, I believe it was her senior year, in Moscow, at a Moscow university. Her family comes from Russia. Her grandfather or great-grandfather came over, supposedly, according to the biography of her family, it's called Family Circle. One of her forebears, Lenin, endowed a chair at a Moscow university in
Wow.
one of her ancestors. Yes. And of course, her father was a very famous radical lawyer, Leonard Boudin, represented Cuba, represented all kinds of communists and radicals and draft card burners and, all the things that were going on at that moment. But it's really fascinating to me. I did not know until very recently that she had actually spent I think it was something like 14 months in the Soviet Union in the 1960s. That's significant. That's very significant. And her son, her biological son, is now the DA of San Francisco trying to defund the police. Well, we can go back to Lenin himself and see what he says about the importance about breaking the police as the protector of law and order, property, and all the rest of it. So you see the continuum here. It exists. This is not stuff that just came up in 2020 or 2015 with the advent of Black Lives Matter. This is a long march, very successful march. So you have the Boudin family. You have this connection to Soviet Union. You have Bernardine Dorn traveling, making the same, and the weather people traveling to communist conferences to talk with the North Vietnamese while America was on the battlefield in Vietnam, going to be trained up by Cuban intelligence in Cuba. I mean, they had a very close relationship with Cuban intelligence, the Weather Underground, to a point where Larry Grathwohl, who was an FBI informant, very brave, who infiltrated for some time, he talks about how they were so close that while they were underground, if you needed to get back connected to your weather comrades, you would go to the Cuban consulate in Canada. Yes, and walk in and say you were looking for Delgado.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
What does Delgado mean? Is that just a name?
Code word. It was a code word that would, say, okay, we'll connect you to your buddies. So it was a very close relationship. This is something that's been discounted and forgotten about. I mean,
look at this. Sorry, Diana. Yeah. I put in Delgado. I mean, I guess it's because of my location, but I mean, that's just probably a last name, not alleging any problem with Delgado Travel. But at the same time, why does a travel agency exist in 2020? And that's an interesting name for it.
Yeah.
Panama. Maybe we could go visit Mossack Fonseca.
Okay. You never know. I wouldn't say no until I looked, but it was certainly the truth in the 1970s. Now, this was a time, there's another piece of it, because I was just going to say, there were so many bombings in New York City and New Jersey and elsewhere. The U.S. Senate was bombed. I mean, these people were very violent. And it was a time when the FBI was really losing its grip on all kinds of human intelligence surveillance. They'd been cut back by the courts and for example, when the just horrendous bombing of the Francis Tavern in New York City occurred, I believe it was 1975, killing 4 people at lunch there, including a young father named Frank Connor. I know his son, Joe. Yes, and wounding 50-some people. It was a terrible, terrible incident. The FBI, the Justice Department, they I saw this in an old story. They were talking about how they felt terribly constricted. They didn't have human intelligence. They weren't able to surveil. This was what really perked up my ears. They had destroyed their files on these Puerto Rican radicals.
The FBI did?
Yeah, that's what this
Why?
man is. Well, this would be probably, I don't know why. I don't know who made that kind of an order. But Jason, when I was working on American Betrayal, one of the really astonishing things that I learned was of a similar act during World War II, where communist subversive files that in those days, naval intelligence was doing a lot of this kind of tracking, were destroyed, were just wiped out. And this, of course, allows the communist agents a lot more free reign. If no one knows who they are, right, then they have a real cover.
But
Well,
Diana, isn't that something that would only be done, I mean, quite obviously by someone trying to protect these
yes,
people from prosecution?
exactly. That's what really that the similarity is what really caught my attention. And I don't know much more than that. I just know they felt left-footed on the whole thing, or back-footed, if that's the phrase. And the fact is that on the Francis Tavern explosion, no one was ever specifically charged for that. They never really solved it. FALN members were arrested for other bombs, were put in jail. We have Bill Clinton to thank for a massive pardon. Do you remember that, around
Yeah.
2000?
Well,
We have
but sorry, real quick. I wanted to ask you because I just found out about the Young Lords today for the first time, and they're from Puerto Rico. FALN is from Puerto Rico, but I couldn't find any direct link between the two groups. Are they connected?
I saw questions about that in the old 1970s stories. There seems to have been some overlap, but they were working on that. There were the Young Lords at a certain point disappear, or they're they just kind of disband. And I couldn't tell you for sure, but it was certainly something that was on the minds of law enforcement as they were trying to track these people. I saw one man who was involved in Lincoln Detox. It was one of the big people there. His name was Vicente Alba, and he was later in the Young Lords, and he was later under suspicion of being an FALN. And I don't think they were ever able to really come up with anything. However, he was trying to enter a courtroom, and because of his various activities, the police wanted to search him going in. They wanted to look in his briefcase. This is before 9/11, where we just submit, right? And he didn't want them to look in his briefcase, and they searched him anyway. They found out that he had a gun in a
Oh,
holster on his person. But the judge threw out the case because they called, I guess, illegal search and seizure. So
oh.
they threw evidence. So what's
The
going
case
on
of
with
looking in the briefcase and finding the gun, you mean, got thrown out?
they
Wow.
found this person? Yeah, exactly.
At the
So
courthouse, he walks in with a gun and it gets thrown out for illegal search and seizure. Wow.
I know. I mean, we're just not used to that anymore because we let them see our underwear. I mean, this is a different time and place. But you have to wonder what are the motivations there. I can't really say. But
But we
you
need to stop on that for a second, Diana, because there's so many cases of this. That is how Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn escaped incarceration, was through this illegal search and seizure by the FBI, almost as if they were constantly doing that so that at any given moment they could choose to either honor the law and say, well, this was illegally done, or ignore that as they have so many times today and say, oh, well, we illegally spied on this person, but we're going to prosecute them anyway. It's almost like a switch that they could flip at their choice.
It is. And when I was thinking about our talk today, something new struck me, which is it almost seems like one of the signal achievements of these revolutionaries, whether underground and the rest, was to completely kind of knock the legs out from under our counterintelligence capabilities domestically.
And law
This
enforcement. It's
law
wonderful
enforcement,
if you're a criminal. You can
I
just
mean,
do whatever you want.
exactly, both, exactly. But there was something about this constant testing, with it very often, they were so crude, and very often well, not that, one wants sophisticated terrorists, but there was something about the nature of their crime spree that they end up caught, different times and playing cat and mouse games. And what always seems to happen is the courts come to their rescue. And in the process, the FBI was completely neutered as any kind of law enforcement agency actually trying to protect us from this kind of internal assault. And the Weather Underground was really a big part of that. And that was something else I learned when over the summer talking, as we've been talking and I've been trying to come up with this material. Jennifer Dorn comes up as a very important person here. She was, again, kind of an ancillary person to the actual Weather Army and Black Panther armies, but she was subject to surveillance and burglary by what they used to call black bag FBI actions. When they go in, they try to see who you're talking to find these underground. I mean, remember, her sister and Bill Ayers, brother-in-law, and others who were wanted, they were on the FBI most wanted list, they were underground for years. And so Jennifer Dorn and others who knew them were targeted to see if they might find a lead by looking at what was in their apartment. Now, today, that would be done by looking at people's online
social media, right?
Happens all the time. They're sucking us up all the time. They're looking at these things if they want to all the time, as we found out. They're looking at the presidents, as we found out. I mean, this is, again, it's a different time and place. Back in the 1970s, however, it was the FBI who was slammed for doing this. They went to court. The top officials of the FBI were actually indicted and convicted, two of them, for abridging the civil liberties of Jennifer Dorn and a small group of these weather-connected people, right before a number of their related comrades who were underground and evading arrest hit the Brinks truck. So, I mean, there's this period of years where the FBI is under assault and then convicted and then post facto vindicated, in the sense that these people go on to murder and steal and destroy again. So it's a very strange series of events. But when you actually look back on it, you realize this was a real break point for the FBI as any kind of an institution that was involved in trying to protect us from enemies, domestic. And
now, Diana, sorry to interrupt, but this is a story we've got to discuss, because you are the person who first told me about this guy, Mark Felt. And then we just had, I think it's John O'Connor, who was on the show last week or 2 weeks ago, talking about how he was pivotally involved in bringing forward this guy, Mark Felt, at a time where, by O'Connor's own admission, Felt was like 90 and totally Alzheimer or dementia, or kind of not really so sure of what is going on. And there's all these questions as to whether he is or is not Deep Throat. Now, this story is from 2005, revealed on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now!, which I personally have a number of questions about. But here, someone reading this feeling like Democracy Now! Is the antidote to mainstream news is going to be like, oh yeah, Mark Felt's a deep state, deep throat, violating people's rights with FBI break-ins. But the truth is something quite different than that.
Well, it certainly seems to be very different. I mean, I would say the entire Mark Felt Deep Throat story is not what it seems to be as well. And I was even thinking that, Bob Woodward has a book coming out next month, and we might really want to get into that in the time his book is released. I think around September 15th, he has a book called Rage, another hit at Trump, coming out, which might be a good time to really get into it. But it was interesting to see Mark Felt sort of laundered into Deep Throat, which is supposed to be our great hero of truth and freedom and the American way. I mean, what's interesting about when you actually go back and start reading about Watergate, which I have been doing, again, something I don't have personal institutional memory on or anything like that, but I've been trying to read up on it more because of all these seemingly related events. The FBI solved Watergate. It wasn't Woodward and Bernstein. I mean, the thing that's kind of
Was it
amazing
solved, though?
well, was it solved though? Well, it came to an end with the resignation of a president, but in terms of that initial phase of Watergate, the burglary,
Right.
compare this timeline with what we are living with today, where we get this Kevin Kleinsmith indictment, 5,000 years later, meaningless, very meaningless. Think about it. We had the Watergate break-in in June of 72. The FBI has this problem with the CIA trying to tell them not to investigate the money. They go and investigate the money. They start pulling things together. They've got a grand jury sitting in July. They've got indictments in September, and they have a trial in, I think, starting January. So, I mean, that's action. I mean, that's movement. When you compare that to the Durham, Horowitz, what are the other Huber? I mean, all of these supposed remedies for the Trump assault on the presidency and the campaign and all the rest of it. We've been slow walked for 3 or 4 years now with nothing. At least there was some alacrity there. I think the FBI was more of an independent body at that time. That's another really big difference.
Back in the 70s, you mean?
Yes.
How were they more independent?
Well, I think that you had, at the time of Watergate, you had just had J. Edgar Hoover, who'd been the founding director for decades, die. And the acting director was a man named Patrick Gray.
Right.
And he comes in for about just shy of a year. And I think I've read his memoir that he wrote. He's called In Nixon's Web. I think it's a great book. I'm very impressed with it. He finished it. He died before it could be finished, but his son, Ed Gray, finished it. And it's a really fascinating book. And in this memoir of the time, which is very well documented, you get a sense of a man who came in and, of course, he was from outside the institution, and he was very careful about being in Nixon's pocket while they were trying to investigate this. It was a very difficult position to be in, but it couldn't be more different from a James Comey essentially plotting with the Obama administration and the CIA how to take out the political opposition. I mean, it's night and day in that regard. I don't know the institutional history past this period because I'm just sort of been focusing on this early 70s and then this curious assault on the FBI that was so successfully waged by these revolutionaries. And so, just picking up one more thing about Jennifer Dorn's story is you can look at, you were talking about, well, people aren't going to really embrace as warm and fuzzy something called the Black Liberation Army or something like that, very frightening kind of. But Black Lives Matter, on the other hand, how can you argue? So think about the improvement over a half century in terms of the messaging, even if the goals are the same, which I think they are. Similarly, we can look at these spasmodic, violent, outbursts that were so destructive and horrendous to live through back in the 70s, and comparing sort of and looking at that Lincoln detox, politicization of these junkies, we can sort of see how they've 2.0 style improved their means of delivery today with the corona tyranny. And I've been watching Columbia Nursing School. Jennifer Dorn is her, I don't know what number career it is, but her current career is of a very high-ranking dean of the Columbia Nursing School. She moved from Lincoln Detox and a midwifing organization to the Columbia nursing world, and she's a very big player there. She's in charge of various global efforts. And when you start looking at the language, it's all that language about using health as a means of social transformation, essentially getting control of people's health as this means. It's international. There are even tie-ins with the Gates Foundation and some of these programs.
She was the first director of PEPFAR.
She is?
She was.
I did not know that.
I read that here. Yeah, it says right here, administrative titles, established the first, this is her bio. She established the first freestanding birthing center in inner city community in the Southwest Bronx under the leadership of Dr. Ruth Lubick. She works in 10 sub-Saharan African countries since 1993, building capacity of nurses and midwives in HIV care, something Dr. Fauci and Birx were all over, including the first project director for PEPFAR, which was Birx. And Clinton Foundation connected and all kinds of stuff.
Right, exactly. So she's very enmeshed in that world. And I think when you look even at remember back in June when in lockdown New York, the healthcare workers said, hey, Black Lives Matter is so important, we're going to forget about the lockdown. And they came out and protested. I mean, well, she was all over that. And if you look in the Twitter feed, you can see a Jennifer Dorn getting her 200 plus students to do these Black Lives Matter posters. And, you could say, well, what does that have to do with nursing? Well, apparently a lot, because if Lincoln Detox was about politicization of junkies, it looks like nursing school and medical school, and not just at Columbia, has a lot to do with politicizing medicine today and healthcare people, nurses and doctors as well. Yale's another one where I found an awful lot of woke Twitter feeds going during the same period. And I think most people would be very surprised to learn that. But, just looking at the connections here, I just wanted to do a couple more, which is if Patrisse Cullors is mentored by a weathered underground guy, Eric Mann back in the day wrote a biography of George Jackson, a very famous prisoner who was killed in a shootout that led to Angela Davis being charged with murder as an accessory. She bought the guns. And, there was a California judge who was murdered in the courtyard shootout. I mean, you start seeing these connections, blah, blah, blah. Well, Jennifer Dorn's second husband was one of Angela Davis's lawyers. So you start seeing how these people, it's like they really move in a kind of red lockstep. It's not a thread. I wrote a little book called The Red Thread. It's like a red mesh. I mean, these people don't seem to leave each other's side. They move in and out of each other's orbits. They have children. They work together. They help each other. It's truly astonishing how widespread their impact is. And right now, it seems like it's never been more significant at this moment in their effort against Donald Trump and the country.
I want to ask you something, Diana, because again, you're raising points that a million questions are flying through my head. So you're talking about Jennifer Dorn went to Moscow. Who was it that went to Moscow? Not Jennifer.
She studied in Moscow and Leningrad for something like 14 months in the 60s.
Okay, and we also spoke about Patrisse Cullors on television or a podcast or wherever she was, proudly saying, well, I'm a Marxist. That's the kind of thing, if you say it to somebody who's 20, that's like saying, I'm a phlebotomist. They don't necessarily know what that means. So it's like, okay, you're a Marxist. And if you indoctrinate somebody, like if you're 18, 19, you go to class, you have this professor, she's kind of like a cool older lady. She was around in the 60s. She's, screw the man, whatever is going to get a teenager excited. You can quite easily shape the thinking of that person. And so when I'm thinking about all these people who are presenting, oh, well, I'm a Marxist and that's cool, I'm reminded of this television interview that oddly surfaced. I think people in 2020 cannot appreciate how bizarre this is that some random guy working in a book depository would have been on television in 1963. This is not YouTube, and frankly, it's not even the 1990s where people had VHS cameras. The notion of being on television in 1962, it was like me telling you, hey, I'm flying to Mars. It's not really too likely to happen. But in this conversation, Lee Harvey Oswald clarifies that he's not a communist, but he proudly says that he's a Marxist. So now we've got Patrisse Cullors saying the same thing. There's a lot of people who feel like this Fair Play for Cuba committee was controlled by the FBI or the CIA. There's this whole nexus between criminals and people who are maybe engaged in espionage and traveling to the Soviet Union in unlikely circumstances. Bill Clinton traveled to the Soviet Union. What is going on with all these people?
Well, I think they're very dangerous, and they were going to be trained up in some cases. Certainly, we know the weather people who went to Cuba were trained up by Cuban intelligence. We know this would help the 20-something, I think, to understand what this really means. When they met with North Vietnamese representatives, America was fighting North Vietnam. We had soldiers being killed, being horribly maimed and being destroyed on the field of battle. And these people were meeting with them and being lectured to by them. And as a result of these lectures, coming back to the United States, for example, in 1969, and instigating what's known as Days of Rage in Chicago, starting protests to stoke the political situation. I mean, this is cause and effect. This is working with the enemy. I mean, this is treason. And, the notion that it has never been reckoned, these people have never had to face any kind of reckoning. Bill Ayer's famous line, what is it? Guilty as
Free
hell.
as a bird, yeah.
America's the whole country. Yeah. I mean, this is the real deal, and that's when you do wonder who is protecting these people, how this all works. I don't know that you and I could do what they did and get away with it. I mean, frankly,
Right.
Who knows? Who knows?
I think you couldn't.
But think about also, we talk about the sort of this now widespread case to defund police, to break open prisons. Think about the presidents who did the same thing in releasing these revolutionaries. We had Bill Clinton making it possible for Susan Rosenberg and another lady, Linda Sue Evans, I believe her name, also involved in these same. She was, I think, stockpiling massive weaponry for more of these kinds of assaults. On the last day of office, he commutes their sentences, making it possible for them to leave jail. We have the FALN pardons. And then later we have Barack Obama following suit in terms of releasing a very bad FALM guy who he was so intransigent, he wouldn't even take the original Clinton get out of jail free card, but he did take it from Barack Obama. And this was someone that nobody in law enforcement, nobody familiar with these cases wanted to see these people released because of the misery and murder that they had been responsible for. But so you have presidents, in a sense, letting felons free, violent felons free, and then now you have their ideological spawn doing the same on a more massive scale. It's kind of a weird thought, but it seems like it works when you realize Barack Obama coming up in a Marxist incubator, Frank Marshall Davis, the communist operative, being his early mentor, Bill Ayers. He was basically given the seat of a woman named Alice Palmer in Chicago, who was a very notable fellow traveler of the Soviet Union, that kind of thing. You have Bill Clinton. We're talking about the Weather Underground. Let's talk about Bill Clinton, the anti-war protester in England, who makes this trek to not just Moscow, but also Prague, working with some very scary people over there in terms of communists, and then still becoming our president. I mean, this is the same time frame. He was also a revolutionary. It's kind of incredible how embedded in the institutions all of these people managed to become, which again tells you the state of the institution before they got there, right? I mean, they wouldn't get there if you had real strong Americanism going there. They'd say, to hit the road.
It would never fly. But that takes me to my next question that I want to ask you, because, I mean, again, Patrick Gray is somebody that I never heard of until you began speaking to me about him. And this book, In Nixon's Web, is definitely something that I want to check out. But, when you were mentioning this just earlier, it seems to me like L. Patrick Gray might have been kind of not in on the joke, and he's actually trying to run the FBI properly, and they're sort of like, wait a minute, get this guy out of here. We don't want to be arresting people.
basically. That was kind of the feeling I got from reading the book. It comes through pretty loud and clear. Certainly, the old guard in the FBI wanted his job, so he had natural enemies there, including Mark Felt. And then you had Nixon trying to, cover up and survive and run rings around everyone he could. So it was not an enviable position to be in, and very difficult. And the book is really interesting. I think it's very frank. He's very frank about the mistakes he made. He's very frank about he went in as a great believer in our institutions and the presidency and in Richard Nixon himself, and he comes out in just absolutely. I don't want to use the word broken, but absolutely disgusted beyond words with all of the above. And he went through years of court jeopardy. He was tried and had different kinds of lawsuits against him,
Really?
also from these things. So he went through a mill, not unlike really what I was thinking. I was reading, I was thinking, this is sort of like General Flynn,
Right.
again, running the gauntlet, ultimately exonerated, but at what cost? He was a very much a man of action himself. He'd had a tremendous career as a submariner in World War II, and he'd been a boxer at the Naval Academy and all of this. And I saw a book talk that his son gave, and he said that his father, who died before the book was completed, and I think he was very ill, but he said if I'd been alone, if I hadn't had a family, I would like to have taken all these people. And he was talking about the top of the White House, the president, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, those people. So I would like to have taken them all individually into a closet with a baseball bat. That's what I would have done. And you kind of think about his being a very much a man of a big athlete and a big warrior. And you kind of think, yeah, I can see that having crossed his mind. But that was
Yeah.
how strongly he felt at the end of this horrendous process and all the betrayals along the way, including by his opposite number at the CIA at the time and so on, where he just felt, he was definitely fighting blind, I think, for quite some time. So very
Yeah.
interesting.
He's got to be about the most FBI-looking guy I've ever seen in my entire life. But the thing
Yeah.
is, it's interesting to just look even at this without delving too much into his history, that he's preceded by Clive Tolson, the acting director of the FBI. It's important for people to understand, if they haven't heard of Clive Tolson before, how close this individual was to J. Edgar Hoover, purported to be his homosexual lover. But, we know, I think, now a bit more about the operation of the FBI in terms of James Comey and Andrew McCabe and who's in charge and who's actually doing stuff and where the things happen. I mean, the fact also that J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI, I think, for 46 years, and our friend Patrick Gray was in there for one. That's quite a stark contrast.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, he was a placeholder, really. I guess he was nominated to be director, but in the midst of all of these scandals, he withdrew his name. But on the homosexual stuff, there's actually literally no evidence for that. It's one of those things that is just out there, but it is one of those. I think it's a canard in terms of no proof. Certainly they were super close, which isn't to suggest they were not.
Vacationing together and stuff like that. It was a little weird.
I think that there's, kind of a range of human experience here, but I don't think there's evidence. There's certainly no evidence, in the same breath, people say Hoover was a cross-dresser. There's no evidence of this. It's like they put these things out there about people. So anyway, I just mentioned that. Tolson was very ill. And if he was, as far as I understand it, if he was, Wiki may be a little off there, because if he was acting director, it was basically holding the chair until Gray could arrive, because it was pretty quick. Tolson probably would have been FBI director if he hadn't been ill. But he was very ill, and I don't know when he died, but he was not able to remain a force at the FBI. And, then we have Mark Felt, and, very much on the make. I think that sort of describes Mark Felt, and then sort of laundered into this deep throat character, which we can talk about probably another time. But very, very strange, in terms of now we see the FBI as having been acting as the democratic attack machine and completely subverted its role back in the day when they were being dinged, or not dinged, they were going to trial over real threat to this country. We see them in the 2016 and forward fabricating evidence, certainly perpetrating fraud on the court to get a warrant, that kind of thing, which was not what they were doing in the 1970s period when this was going on. And you see a conviction for the civil rights of the weather people. And today we see the civil rights of a General Flynn or a Carter Page or whoever. And absolutely not even a question. It's not even on anyone's lips. So we see a lot of weird flippage here that I'm still kind of trying to, kind of put in order. But certainly sea changes. And the constant is this revolutionary influence, consistent and now flowering in the most threatening, dangerous way. So that's kind of where we are with all of this.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to discuss about it. We could do pretty much endless shows on the topic, and I definitely want to continue exploring this. I do want to remind people that they can learn more about Diana and her writing by going to dianawest.net. People should definitely read American Betrayal and The Red Thread. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that we're talking about today that viewers haven't heard before, or if they have, this is stuff that I'm talking about all the time with you and other guests, and even I'm learning things and details about it that we would have never known. There's so many areas to go into, but I'm afraid we're out of time right now, Diana. Anything else you'd like to touch on real quick before we close out the show for today?
No, I think we've really kind of set the table on some of this information. I'm glad I got it off my chest. It's been a long summer thinking about it, and I'm really glad I learned a little bit extra about Jennifer. I'd missed her being a founding director of PEPFAR. I think that's very important because, as I noted, the Gates Foundation is in on some of her international programs in Africa, and that's always alarming. So, yeah.
It's also amazing because, no matter how tough you are, no matter how rich you are, when you're in the hospital and your health is at stake, it's everything. The wealthiest person in the world would spend their last cent to save themselves or a family member. Your decision-making process when your body's not working properly, it's very scary, and you become very easily influenced. And I think, let me be careful what I say, because I've been getting so many communications from the various technocratic mechanisms. Let's just say that if someone causes you to believe that your health is at risk, they can convince you to do a lot of things that you otherwise might not do.
Right.
Tyrannical control of healthcare. Well, Diana, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, and I appreciate all the information you've been sharing with us. And I want to thank everybody for watching and remind them that they can support Crowdsource the Truth by going to subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and becoming a sponsor. You're going to enjoy a huge library of sponsor-exclusive content, and you keep the show going. I can't bring you fantastic guests like Diana West without your support and sponsorship. So thanks everybody for watching, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.